Welcome back, everyone. I just got back from LA where I did the most extensive and intricate photo shoot of my entire career, where I photographed 42 professional athletes for 6 to 8 minutes each in one day. So in this video today, I'm going to break down for you the planning, the setup, and the execution of the shoot, and everything I learned along the way. So a few months ago, a repeat client called and asked me if I'd be available to do a shoot for them and photograph the top football draft picks for their trading cards. And I was really excited to do this because I've done it 5 or 6 times before, and each time I do one of these shoots, they become more and more complicated, and it's just a lot of fun working on these sets. I feel like coming up with the plan is fun, building the set is fun, and then the shoot itself is fun as well, because along the way there's all sorts of complications and all sorts of things that we have to work out, and I find that I really like it whenever something is really complicated. So on that first day when we do the setup, I like to say that we're building the factory, and on the second day that we're shooting, I like to say that we're working in the factory. And doing a shoot like this is really rewarding, especially when everything comes off great and the pictures look good. And so I want to walk you through the process today of working with a commercial client, coming up with a plan, getting it approved, executing the setup, and doing the photo shoot, so that you'll know what it's like working in a situation like this in case you're ever doing it, and maybe it'll give you some ideas that you can use on your next shoot. So my client said that they wanted to have primarily a black background for this set, and that another photographer would be shooting mostly on a white background. So I came up with a series of shots that I thought would work with that theme in mind. And I came up with a PDF using Satellite 3D here at my desk. And I used Satellite 3D to simulate what the entire set was going to look like so I could show them an overall plan. And I used examples of photos that I'd taken before in order to give them an idea of what I wanted to do. And in some instances, I needed to use Satellite 3D to simulate the exact thing that I wanted to do because I didn't have an example of it. For instance, on the third look that I proposed, I was using colored light coming through some diffusion material, and the problem there was in the examples I had, I was using 2 colored light sources coming through, and when you have 2 colored light sources, those colored light sources blend together, and that causes a third color. So if I, in this instance, were to use the bear's primary color of blue and their accent color of orange where they overlapped, I would likely get magenta, or a magenta-ish color, and that was going to look very, very bad. So I had to come up with an idea where I used blue for the primary color and white for the accent color. So these are things that I had to work out with Satellite 3D in advance to show them in an entire PDF guide where I showed them examples, behind the scenes things, talked about the workflow, talked about the posing, and all of those things in this handbook, or, PDF briefing deck, essentially. And I shared that with the client. A lot of times my client has had ideas in the past where they had specific photos they wanted to execute, but they didn't have that this time, so they went with the ideas that I had. Originally, I thought we were going to have 10 to 12 minutes per player. It turned out that we ended up having 6 to 8 minutes per player. And so we just talked about how we were going to shorten down the posing for each look and streamline things in order to get things done in that limited period of time. The other thing we had to work out in advance was that I was going to use colored lights and colored gels to make things happen in backgrounds, and I had to have a plan in advance for what colors I was going to use. Once we had our plan in place, I then needed to figure out which gear I needed, what I needed to bring with me, what I needed to borrow, what I needed to rent, and what I needed to buy and have shipped to my local assistant, Wiley. So I figured out how many lights I needed. That then told me that I needed to borrow some things from the Mac Group. They're the distributor for Elinchrom and Nanlite, and so I asked for certain things from each of them to be shipped over to Wiley. I figured out what I could bring with me. I also went to Las Vegas a few months ago to speak at WPPI, and I had to leave behind some lights with my friend Josh. And when I did a workshop in his studio, I picked up those lights. I gave them to my friend Anthony, and he sent them on to Wiley. So that's how we got all of that gear there. Then on top of that, there were some backgrounds that I needed that I shipped directly to Wiley that I bought new, because shipping them from my studio and back would have cost more money than just getting her new stuff. And then when it came time for me to fly to LA, I flew on Southwest Airlines, and I always fly on Southwest because they have a baggage policy that says if you have something that says media, then you can check overweight and oversized items for free up to a limit for the first 2 bags. And so I did that, and I flew to Burbank. And if you've ever been to Burbank before, it's really cool because it's a very small airport in the LA suburbs, close-ish to where we were going to be working. And when you fly there on Southwest, you actually get off the plane on jet stairs and a ramp rather than a jet bridge, and you're outside, and it's just a fun, different experience. And then I went to pick up my gear at Baggage Claim, where they actually only have 2 carousels, and they're outdoors. Thankfully, Wiley picked me up. We got to the hotel and were able to get some rest. Also, I'm going to link to all the gear that I'm using in the description, and if you click on those links and buy anything from those retailers afterwards, I'll get a small commission. So please do that to help support me to make more videos like this one. Also, if you could please like, subscribe, and sign up for the bell, I would really appreciate it. On the day before the shoot, Wiley and I headed over to Sammy's to get all of the rental equipment, which was almost exclusively light stands and a cart, which we used to get all of the gear from the vehicles into the venue. And speaking of vehicles, we also went and rented a car so that we would have 2 vehicles to move all of the gear, myself, Wiley, and Pebbles, our second assistant. Then we headed over to the venue and started to get things set up. There was a little hiccup though. We started our setup at 3 p.m. and I thought that the vendors that were hired to do the pipe and drape for the entire photo shoot, this photo shoot wasn't necessarily just for me or for the trading card company. There were a lot of people on site creating a lot of content for a lot of different purposes, and the players were cycling through each person's set back to back throughout their day, which I think they were each there for about half a day. So because of that, we needed to have pipe and drape set up in this gym that we were shooting in so that our flashes wouldn't interfere with other people's video sets, and we'd have a little bit of privacy. But those vendors that were there to set up the pipe and drape, they weren't there. So we had to set up everything that we were doing in vaguely the location where we were going to do it, in the 35 by 35 foot footprint that we had for our set. One key thing that I was waiting for was for them to set up an 8 by 8 foot room in the corner with a ceiling over the top. I needed this room that was open on one side so that I could block that overhead lighting from the gym, because it was probably about 4,000 Kelvin and fairly bright. And if I had it there, then that was going to possibly contaminate the colors that I was going to get on a continuous light set. So we got everything set up as best as we could, including one of the sets where we're using different colored gels in order to gel a gray backdrop. And so what we did though on this setup day was we looked at all the gels that we were going to use, which were the accent colors for the jerseys. That's the color that we were going to make that background. We looked at all of those colors that we needed and tested those out and saw what the power settings needed to be for each gel and notated it in a spreadsheet. And we also went one layer further and got together purple, just in case for some reason we ended up having the Minnesota Vikings show up in a white jersey when we were expecting them in a purple jersey, and then we would need that purple color for the background. We wanted to be prepared for everything, and we were. We weren't able to set up that nan light look in the corner until they got that pipe and drape up, and unfortunately they didn't start doing that until about 10 p.m. And around 11 p.m. Wiley graciously volunteered to stay along with Pebbles and get that set up so that I could go back to the room to sleep, because we were starting the photo shoot day the next day at 6:30 in the morning. So they were troopers and stayed there and got the setup done as best as they could until about 1 in the morning. And then we left the hotel at 6 in the morning to go back to the gym to make sure we had everything set up. When we got there, we started finalizing the setup in each location now that we had the pipe and drape up. And once we had that finalized, we then went through and tried a posing routine and a workflow, and things were a little bit different than I expected. So, for instance, Alex, the art director who I was working with, said that he wanted to do some shots with and without a helmet. And I guess I thought in advance I would have a helmet on for everything. And so the order of shots that I thought about ended up being different than the order that we did the shots in was different than what I had thought about doing in advance. So I thought about shooting some action shots first with the helmet on, but instead we did some portraits first with the helmet off. And the reason for that is when they have the helmet on for a while, it puts this red mark on their forehead, and we definitely didn't want those for the helmet off portraits. So we did the helmet off portraits first, and then the helmet on shots second. So now let's get into each one of the setups, and I'm going to do this in the order in which we shot them so that it will be a little clear to you as we go. So I started off with this Elinchrom 190 centimeter indirect octabox here with a 40-inch Matthews floppy in front of it. Now, normally I would use a V-Flat World V-Flat for this, but I didn't want to buy a V-Flat just for this particular shoot. And Sammy's rented these 40-inch wide floppies that extend to 40 by 80 inches, and so it's a perfect replacement. And so I used that in front of the octabox, and what I'm doing here for this first look is essentially I'm getting the look of 3-strip softboxes, but instead of using 3-strip softboxes and 3 lights, I'm getting it done with 1 light and 1 modifier. A little nuance here, though, is I had to step over to my left and have the player turn his head a little to his right and look at a white X that we put onto the wall in order to get the light to wrap around onto the player's left eye, which was on the side of the camera. One thing as well is when I had taller players, I had to lift the flag and the octabox up, which Pebbles did. And when we had shorter players, he moved it down. If you don't put a mark on the wall for where the players will look, they'll look every which way possible. And so you just need to give them something to anchor where they're looking so you get consistent shots throughout the day. Then for the second setup, I had them move 90 degrees to their right and face the octabox, this time essentially getting a shot that looked like it was lit with a strip softbox from the side. In general, all of the things that I did, except for this particular look, were things that I'd done before. But this one was something new, and it's okay to do a little bit of new stuff when you're working under pressure like this, but hopefully don't do a lot. Don't try to reinvent the wheel. So for this shot and the previous one, I had the athlete's pose, or Alex had the athlete's pose by holding the football in front if they were a quarterback, or cradling the ball in their arm that was closest to the camera if they played a different position. And I think when we had a defensive player, we actually had them posing in that second look with their hands up as though they were on the line, just getting ready for the ball to be hiked. And since I mentioned posing and Alex doing some of that, I just want to sort of let you know how we were working together during the day. So Alex was the art director. He is ultimately in charge. But there are some things that I can see from the camera's perspective that he can't see, so things that I have to adjust. But for the most part, I let him call the poses in the order in which we did them, and then gave him feedback as to what was working after we shot each player. And in real time, I stepped in, adjusted the player as I needed them to, just a small amount in order to get things going. The other thing is, typically when I'm doing these shoots, there is loud music in the room and the players can't hear me usually from where I am. And so I have to rely on the art director in those situations. But we work together as a team to get things going. And sometimes he had to step away in order to talk to someone about logistics, and I just executed and went through our plan as though he were there, but I called all of the shots in that situation. Then we got over to our next set, and this one is a little complicated and really cool. So the key here is I'm using a 5-foot wide roll of Lee diffusion material, and this material allows light to pass through it, but you can't see anything through it. So what I did was I placed it in the middle of my set, and behind it I had a 9-foot wide gray paper backdrop that I lit with gels. And I lit those so that it was the accent color, of course, for the jersey that I was, the player that I was shooting. And that light reflected off of that gray background and came through the diffusion material, making the diffusion material that overall color. Then I placed a third light. I was using 2 for the gels, 1 on each side. And I had a third light there pointed back at the camera. And that was creating this white light, which I referred to as my sun during the shoot. Then I had a Black Pro mist filter on the camera, and that was causing that light coming through the background to flare and create a little bit of haze around the athlete. And one thing I didn't mention, I actually used 2 cameras, 2 tether cables, 2 lenses, and 2 laptops for the shoot. And the reason why is I had 2 looks where I used that filter, and I had 3 looks where I didn't use a filter. So I didn't have time to switch lenses and switch filters during the shoot, and I just needed to have it be consistent across the board. And speaking of that, the exposure for those first 2 setups and the setup at the end of the shoot that I'm going to use that camera on, they were exactly the same exposure, so I didn't have to change any settings on the camera. In this middle set though, I then lit the player from the front on camera right with a 1x3 foot or 30 by 100 centimeter Elinchrom strip softbox, and I took the outer layer of diffusion off, put a grid on it, and also used a flag. Now the reason why I ended up doing those 3 things was because I couldn't have any of the light from this main light get onto the diffusion material, because if I did, then it would cause a dull, washed out color in that area where it was hitting the diffusion material. So I had to use kind of an extreme strategy here to get the job done. Then on camera left, I used another 30 by 100 centimeter strip softbox, and I had it at very low power, and I was just using it there for fill. This wasn't part of my original plan, but I did have this extra gear on hand because I thought I might end up needing it, and I did in fact end up needing it. Then on the next set, I was using continuous lights, specifically 8 Nanlite Pavo tubes as my background, and I used a series of safety cables, S-binders, and zip ties in order to make a 4-tube rope ladder on each side that I hung off of a C-stand and a boom arm. And make sure if you're doing this that you use a sandbag at the end of the boom arm and at the bottom of the C-stand so you keep everything safe so it doesn't fall over. I then used a 120 Pavo Slim on camera left as my main light, and the same light on camera right as my fill light. Now, this setup required a different exposure. In fact, I had to double my ISO compared to the last set. So I went from 500 ISO to 1000 ISO, and I had to change my f-stop from f8 on the set with the diffusion material to 5.6 on this Nanlite set. So that was pretty easy. I just did 3 clicks on the ISO wheel and 3 clicks on the f-stop wheel, and I got my exposure right every time. I didn't mess that up too much, so it worked out pretty good. The other thing I want to point out here is that on the previous set, I lit the player from camera right, and on this set, my main light was on camera left. And that was intentional because I wanted to have 2 vastly different posing routines and looks between these 2 sets so that I would give the client variety for the cards. In fact, when we started doing the posing, we realized that it was kind of pointless to have the player turn away from the light in these 2 locations. So we made sure that they were either square to the camera or turned towards the light on these sets so that we would get the best look. On the Pavo Tube set, I wasn't really planning this, but we ended up doing a lunging photo like we did in the second scene And that required me to lower the light down and change the footprint position. And so I had Pebbles do that for me in real time. And so not having him there to help would have been a huge hindrance for the execution of this set. At least it would have slowed me down quite a bit. So that was a great help. Then I switched cameras and went over to our 5th set, and that's where we did a simulated action setup. So for this one, I started off by having an Elinchrom 3 with a high output reflector as my main light at the end of a boom arm. And originally I had that boomed out there directly over the middle of the set, and I would have to have Pebbles like move the thing up and down every time to make sure the shadows fell in the right place. Eventually I found that this looks sort of like a direct flash look, and so I had Pebbles move that light, or I moved that light over to camera right a little bit. Then in front of me I had another Elinchrom 3 with a high output reflector, and that was my fill light. I found that I needed this in some testing that I did in advance, because otherwise that shadow from the helmet was going to be jet black and I needed to fill in the shadows. Then on camera left and camera right in the background, I used an Elinchrom indirect strip softbox without any diffusion material. Now the fact that this is an indirect modifier means that the light points away from the subject, and because of that you can take the diffusion material off and it becomes a large skinny reflector. If I didn't have this fancy modifier, I probably would have used 2 or 3 lights in a line on one light stand on each side, and that would have got me that head to toe hard light look that I was going for. Of course, if I did that, I would have needed more gear. But this is a better, more efficient way to do things. Then I boomed a light out over the set to be a helmet light in this instance, using a standard reflector, and that light was turned down at minimum power. Now I know you've heard me mention this before, and it's a concept called flash duration. The most efficient way for you to freeze motion in the studio is not by using high-speed sync, it's by manipulating your flash duration in order to freeze motion. And I'll link to a video that's all about it so that you can go in depth on that topic. But just know that I had my lights in action mode in order to do that. And when you're in action mode, the light is fairly blue at minimum power compared to 1/8 power, which is what those strip lights were at. This happens on all brands, that there is a color shift when you have a output in strength when you're in these modes that shorten the flash duration. So because of that, I put a 1/2 CTO gel, color temperature orange, on that helmet light, and I did that so that the 3 lights from the back would be similar white balance coming forward there. Otherwise that hat light would have looked blue relative to the 2 strip softboxes. Similarly, I put a 1/8 CTO gel on my main light and my fill light because they were lower in power than those strip softboxes, and I needed to warm them up a little bit, but that together gave me a very nice cohesive look. When we got to the final shot, I actually had Pebbles turn the main light away from the player, and I had him walk away from me with one raised finger in the air, and he was lit primarily with the fill light and the helmet light as he walked away. And now that gives you a great idea of all the setups we did and the 6,000 photos that we took during the day. But I want to give you sort of a little more advice. If you're ever in a position like this where you're doing a high volume, high pressure commercial shoot like this, it's really important that you work as a team. You as the photographer cannot do everything, and so you're going to need help, and you're going to need to communicate with those team members plans that you have in case things go wrong. Originally, I planned on having 2 extra strobes and 1 extra continuous light on set. But what happened is I ended up using one of those strobes for a fill light, and I ended up using that continuous light also as a fill light. I didn't know for sure that I was going to need them, but I did. And so that meant that I only had 1 strobe in reserve. But guess what? During the setup day, I turned on one of the flashes that I borrowed from Elinchrom, and it turned out that it wasn't functioning. I tried to get it going, but somehow it was maybe damaged in transit or something, and it needed repair. So all of a sudden, I went from having 2 extra strobes on set, just in case something went wrong, to having none. So it's always good for you to have a backup plan so that you have what you need in place or a plan in place in case something goes wrong. So I communicated with my assistant that if any of the flashes we were using stopped working that day, we would take that fill light from the third set, which we didn't really need, and we would repurpose it to do whatever, to replace whatever light wasn't working. Similarly, if one of those Pavo Slim stopped working, I was going to take the fill light and use it as the main light, or maybe the fill light would stop working. In that case, it would be no big deal, but that's what I was going to do. Go without the fill on both those sets. If one of the Pavo tubes stopped working, I would have relocated that non-working one to the bottom of the rope ladders because compositionally I needed at least those top 3 in order to consistently make the pictures that I needed to take during the day. Also, when you're working with an art director on set, just know that you two need to function as a team and make sure that you're explaining to them certain things they need to know that you're seeing through the camera that aren't working, and communicate with them and make sure that you're getting them exactly what they need during the day. That's a good reason to tether too, so that they can see what's going on and what's happening if they need to, and they can go over the shots and make those decisions. It was very important that I had a conversation with my client in advance about that background color and about my overall plan. Because if you just show up and think that you're going to do whatever you want to do, they might not be down with that idea. So make sure that you have everything planned out in advance. The other thing you should probably think about too is you can't turn to your client in a situation like this and say, oh, don't worry about it, we'll fix it in post. Because when you're shooting that much volume and you're under that much pressure, you can't say to a client like that, hey, I think this will work out, trust me, because it's not really going to work like that. They're going to not feel comfortable in that situation. So you got to make sure that you're getting everything right in camera and you're working precisely. And that's why we had marks on the ground for everywhere the players should stand and everywhere I should stand. The players' marks primarily were in white and my marks were in blue. That way I would get the same consistent shots every time, and they would know where to be and I would know where to be, and it was one less thing that I had to think about. So when you're doing volume, consistency is key. Well, I hope that helped and gave you some good ideas as to what you might do if you're ever in a situation like this, so that you can think about how to plan, how to set up, and how to execute a shoot like this. If you have any questions or comments, please leave those below. Also, if you want to take your learning to the next level, you might consider joining my online members-only learning platform, The Academy with John Gress. You might also consider buying a lighting handbook or attending one of my in-person workshops. Thank you so much for your time. Remember to like, subscribe, and sign up for the bell. I hope that you have a wonderful day, and I'll talk to you soon.